Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. We're kind of on an uneven schedule here as we get into the meat of the off season. A couple weeks ago, we had 2 episodes, took last week off, and we are back this week with Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star. We had Zach on, I think, about a month ago and had to cut our conversation a little bit shorter than we would have liked. So got some time here today with Zach and the news for Indiana basketball. It's weird, Zach, that it always, there are kind of lulls in terms of the news cycle as it relates to Indiana basketball, but there's usually always something going on in some capacity. And late last week we learned this has been in the works for a while, but we actually got confirmation that's going to happen. For the first time since 2014, Indiana is going to take a international trip to play some exhibition games, and I think it comes at a pretty good time right now because you've got the coaching transition, you've got a new roster, a lot of new pieces to integrate, and so they're going to go down to the Bahamas and play a couple of games in August. Zach, what was kind of your reaction when you heard that Indiana was going to do this, and what do you think maybe in terms of what we'll learn from this? I mean, I remember back to the trip, we were both there in Montreal. I thought there was, from a team building and just getting organized, I guess, giving yourself those extra practices, I thought it was beneficial for Indiana. I don't know how much kind of it translates over to the actual season, but what do you think Indiana is going to be able to get out of this experience?
I think actually, you and I were also talking before we started about how it feels a little bit strange that Indiana's only playing 2 games. I think you can play up to 10. Obviously, when Indiana went to Montreal, you and I were there, they played 5. I sort of suspect that this trip isn't necessarily about the games as much. Not that Indiana won't see value in the games, but I think Indiana, from a tangible perspective, will see a lot of value in the practices. If you think about it, what is it, either 25 or 26 practices you get in those 42 days building up to your, in the actual preseason in October and November. I mean, so 10 practices is almost half again as many as you'd get in a normal year. It's the equivalent of getting your bowl practices for a football program, making a bowl game and getting your bowl practices. And football coaches talk all the time about how valuable that time is. And so I think on the court, it's going to be very, important for Mike Woodson because it's a chance to really, sort of lay some foundations and maybe, almost get the ground floor built, on his principles, his philosophies, his systems, so that when everybody comes back together for those preseason practices, they're not necessarily starting as, kind of as close to zero as they would normally be. I just wonder if the trip is more about the team. And, we haven't heard Mike Woodson really talk much about it yet, but this is a team that's got 5 new faces, 3 new coaches, including a new head coach. You've got, even some of the guys that have been here in the past, a guy like Brian Walsh, Vinny Sander, guys in different roles now. And, not for nothing. Obviously, the last year and a half has been tough on all of us. It's just been tough in different ways. And while athletes got to play their seasons, their lives weren't somehow just great because of it. You and I, I'm sure, have both heard, anecdotes about kids who didn't get to go home to visit sick or dying relatives, or maybe attend funerals of relatives that died, including some that died of COVID. When you look at the restrictions that were in place on these kids, not being able to take many, if any, in-person classes, having to really sequester themselves away from, their respective student bodies, and, even talking to kids and people around kids, if let's say you lived with 3 of your teammates, one of you got COVID, well, you're all then quarantined for 2 weeks. And in some situations, if another guy in the apartment or the dorm or whatever gets COVID, then that's another 2 weeks. And there were guys where like you maybe didn't leave your apartment for a month. And I'm just not sure that especially when you consider all the new faces and all the change and all the attendant, sort of upheaval or turmoil or whatever word you want to use that can cause. When you couple that to just the fact that I think everybody deserves a week at the beach after what we've all been through over the last year, I just sort of wonder if the Bahamas piece of this trip, they're going to play games. You have to play games, and you want those games because, you're another point you made before we started. My perception is this as well. This team is actually pretty good. This team from Serbia that they're playing. So now you're going to have 2 full games worth of film that you can refer guys back to all preseason, in terms of, okay, we got 10 practices to work on all this stuff. And then we went out and we didn't play, a bunch of semi-pro teams. We weren't playing, some of those teams that IU played in Canada that were basically Canadian college teams that just ultimately weren't. A couple of them were good, but, a couple more really, I think 3 of those 5 games were just demolitions. Serious film you can break down and take with you into the preseason. But I also just wonder if this trip isn't a little bit about saying, let's all just go to the beach together and have some time to bond a little bit, to shake off whatever we're all collectively carrying from the last 18 months and get ready for some new beginnings at IU.
Yeah. One of the things that really stood out to me when I learned kind of more, I knew that in the weeks prior to this was in the works and it was something that was maybe going to happen. But when I learned that they were only playing 2 games and it was going to be against the competition that, looking at it on paper, I was looking at the roster for this team, BC Mega. They're out of Belgrade, Serbia. I believe, I don't know if he's still with this organization, still playing with them. Scoochie Smith that played point guard for Dayton when Archie Miller was there is a player that's on this team. So this is going to be a team, assuming they have their full complement of guys, they're going to have some talent and be capable of winning. You compare this to what Indiana played. This was back in 2017 when they went to the Bahamas. They played 3 games. This are the names of the teams they played. Commonwealth Bank, which to me sounds like just like a rec league team almost. Guatemala and Bahamian Select, and they just destroyed these teams. So I don't necessarily think they got much value necessarily from the games. Montreal, as you mentioned, back in 2014, if I recall correctly, there was 2 teams that were pretty good. Obviously, Indiana lost one of those games, and then the other 3 games were teams that they were able to beat pretty comfortably. This is, as much as you say, kind of, it's about the practices and the team togetherness. I do think there's something to be learned from these games, just in terms of getting a barometer of where you are by playing a professional team from Serbia. I was a little bit surprised that Indiana didn't toss in a game there that they for sure knew they were going to be able to win, because if this team does end up being pretty good, it could be interesting just to kind of see the reaction and what it looks like if they go down there and have their hands full for a couple of games.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Again, I think the flip side of that is win or lose, you get value out of the games you play. And again, in a first year, a lot of times, I think the two settings where it seems like programs like to take preseason tours are either A, when they're going to have a pretty young team and, there's a lot of new faces and they just really want the extra time to integrate guys and build chemistry and all that, or B, when they are really experienced and really ambitious, and there's almost this way of saying, this is where, we have huge goals this season and this is where we start, is with this, we all go away as a team. We get away from the day-to-day of campus and classes and family and friends and even media and things like that. And we just focus on us. And that's where this starts. This is, I'm sure teams have done it, but this is the first time I can remember a team going in a coach's first year. And I really think too, like I suspect that we may, get near the start of the season and hear some players talking about how tired they are of watching film of their games in the Bahamas. Because I suspect from a logistical standpoint, Mike Woodson is going to wear out. I'm assuming these are going to be 2 40-minute games. I'm not sure. I don't know if the details of. I have not seen any details released in terms of, format of the games. Are they going to be playing with the international 3-point line or what? The internet, not the 3-point line, but the international lane or whatever else. But I suspect from a logistical perspective, the value Mike Woodson sees in the games is 10 practices to really drill a bunch of fundamentals into the team, 2 games to let the team go out, put all that on the court, see what works, what doesn't, what needs improved, what doesn't, and then come back with this, with 80 minutes of real life examples. Not saying like, well, this is Carmelo Anthony doing it when I was coaching the Knicks, or this is Joe Johnson doing it when I was coaching the Hawks. But like, this is you doing it. Like, you don't have to visualize yourself as an NBA All-Star. This is just you doing it 2 months ago at the Atlantis Resort in the Bahamas. And this is what was wrong about it. This was what was good about it. Here's what we learned. Here's where we need to improve. And I think that's the value of the games. I was a little bit surprised, too. They were only playing 2. And I think your point is valid about a third. I also have no idea to what degree, because I think this is all being kind of put together by a third party in the Bahamas, the people that put together Battle for Atlantis and the Bahamas Bowl. I don't agree. Maybe they struggled to find other partners. It's worth pointing out, they're bringing a team over from Serbia. The COVID situation is not the same everywhere in the world it is here. It's improving a lot here. Vaccine distribution is moving at a really good pace. If you just look at the national statistics, a lot of people are getting their vaccines, have gotten their vaccines. COVID rates are going down substantially, with the belief that we won't see the same rebound in the fall and the winter that we saw last year. That's not the case everywhere, and that's in particular, that's not the case in parts of Europe. Europe has struggled a little bit with its vaccine rollout. I think it's getting better now, but my point is they may have also, maybe if they were looking for foreign partners, struggled teams that would want to come out of, would want to travel or could travel. There are countries that are under travel advisories and travel warnings. And I think, I could be wrong about this, but I believe the Bahamas may require you to provide proof of COVID vaccination to enter. So the point is, it may have also been about finding some partners that they could, that also wanted to do this, that they could come play with. But one way or the other, I think it feels a little bit like a balance of a lot of different things, because one of the reasons teams don't take a foreign tour like every 4 years is coaches worry about burnout and basically starting the season 2-3 months early. And is that going to just have guys completely worn down by March? So maybe this is also a case for saying, let's not force it and go overboard, essentially.
One question I've gotten already a couple times, and I'm curious if you have any insight on this or any thoughts. These games aren't going to be televised, which everyone's reaction to that is negative, because we're going to have a small percentage of people that are actually going to be able to travel down and make this trip. Any insight from your side of things why they would decide to do that? And do you I was thinking there would be a pretty big market from fans to be able to watch this. Just from, what do you think? I know when we went to Montreal, there may have been one or 2 games at the most that were streamed, but it seems like this would have been an opportunity to get some Big Ten network content at some point in August. But it seems a little odd to me that they're not going to do any type of broadcast of this, at least not planned at this time.
I am a little surprised too, again, because my understanding is the party that's organizing this, the partner, if you want to say, that IU is working with on this, is the same partner that puts together Battle for Atlantis and the bowl game they play down in the Bahamas. And I guess the point I'm making there is not that necessarily these games should be on ESPN, but that you would think that if there was an appetite for that or a desire for that, that, that's the sort of partnership that between obviously IU's capacity or capabilities from a video standpoint and a partner like that, you'd think that would be doable. I don't know if it's a gamesmanship thing and not wanting to broadcast those games so that opponents have, film, even if it's, obviously in a sort of rougher setting, not a ton of practice time, still a bit of an exhibition feel and all that kind of stuff. I could see that being part of it. But I agree with you in the sense that, the appetite is enormous. I'm not sure Indiana fans have been, at very least, this curious about their basketball program since maybe 2012, 2013. And frankly, maybe this excited, justifiably or not, we'll find out. But, I wouldn't be surprised if it was at least in part strategic in terms of saying we don't, the film that Indiana, because I think there's also a rule that anybody that might be there and film it can post no more than 2 minutes of game highlights. Indiana might also feel like, it might also be a situation where Indiana feels like, they don't want anybody to have the full tape but them. And that could be a little bit too. Because again, normally, I don't know how many first-year coaches take their teams on these tours. And so, it's not as much of a consideration when Tom Crean's taken his team on a preseason tour. He's already been in Indiana for 5 years, 6 years, whatever it had been. I think it had been 6 years by then. So it's not like people didn't know what Tom Crean did, what kind of systems he ran and things like that. All of that is completely new for Mike Woodson. So maybe that is part of the consideration, but I've heard the same. I know a lot of people who really wish that there was going to be some sort of outlet to streaming this. But it seems like that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think you make some good points just about the gamesmanship. If I've learned one thing about, and I'm not speaking to this staff specifically, but if I've learned one thing about college sports from covering it now for as long as I have, and I think it's more evident in football maybe than basketball, but anything in terms of advanced scouting that programs feel like they're giving away to other programs that could be used against them in some way or are getting a leg up on somebody, they're going to do everything they can to protect themselves. So I do think part of it could be that. Another consideration could be that, they're just trying to get as many people, this group that's organizing it, as many people to travel down there and buy tickets to go to the game. If you tell people that it's going to be on TV, there's maybe less incentive for people to actually travel down there and spend money at the resort and on accommodations. This is, let's make no mistake about it. The group that's putting this together is doing so with the goal of making money and getting Indiana fans to travel. So that could be, it could be a little bit of all of those things. I know it's a question that we're going to continue to get over the next couple of months on social media, even though I've already answered it a couple of times. I got people asking still about whether it'll be televised. And as of right now, the plan is that it will not be. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the Big Ten, just the offseason that it's had so far. A little less specific to Indiana, but I kind of want to go around the league and get your thoughts on a couple programs that I think have had interesting off seasons. And we'll start with Illinois because the last time we saw them, they were losing in the second round in the NCAA tournament to Loyola. That was a team I think I either picked them to get to the championship game or picked them to win it all, and that obviously didn't turn out very well. But they've undergone a tremendous amount of turnover this offseason. They've lost a pair of assistant coaches to Kentucky. They've lost Io and Kofi to the NBA. Georgie also left early and is going to pursue a professional career. Adam Miller transferred to LSU. And you look at this roster, and it's not looking nearly as stout and intimidating as it was last season. Are you surprised at all, Zach, at how things have seem to deteriorate so quickly at Illinois, and does it feel like maybe their window, at least to kind of contend on the national level under Brad Underwood, has closed pretty quickly? Because just looking at what they've lost and losing those two assistant coaches, to me feels like it could have a pretty significant impact on recruiting moving forward for the Illini.
I mean, I would agree with a lot of that. I'm number one, I'm very skeptical of Illinois, just kind of where they're going to be a year from now. I mean, the like pre-Kofi Coburn, Brad Underwood had only once in his entire career coached a team that defensively finished better than 98th in the country in adjusted efficiency defensively. And I thought that there were times when Illinois got kind of sorry, you can probably hear my dogs barking downstairs. The door's closed and you can still hear them. But when Illinois was a little bit stuck offensively between Kofi, who I think was a really, really good half-court player, and, that plethora of guard talent they had, and maybe, sort of stuck between, do you want to be a team that runs and do you want to be a team that really feeds kind of a half-court big man? Because I don't think Kofi Coburn was always going to be kind of that end-to-end rim-running big that, maybe would have fit an Andre Curbelo or an Ayo Dosunmu a little bit better. But my point in all this is just Kofi Coburn changed everything for Illinois defensively when he showed up. From a rim protection standpoint, from a rebounding standpoint, from a matchup standpoint, and him departing without there being an obvious replacement really anywhere. I think they took Omar Payne from Florida, and I mean maybe Omar Payne is a better defensive player than I'm giving him credit for. But everybody else they signed is a guard or a wing. There's not an obvious replacement for Kofi, who I think stylistically was their most important player last year. And there's not an obvious replacement for Ayo, who, in my opinion, was maybe the best player in the Big Ten last season. I mean, I think I voted for him ahead of Garza, and I don't think there was a wrong choice there. If you voted for Garza, I think that's fine. I think Garza was 1 and Ayo's 2, that's fine. But it was one of those two. And not only did you lose him, but as you point out, you also lost Adam Miller, who sort of felt like the I don't want to say the heir apparent, but certainly the player that was going to be groomed to step into the minutes and the shots that Ayo was going to leave behind. And then to your point about losing those assistant coaches, Orlando Antigua in particular, obviously a coach who is really experienced, really well respected, really, really good recruiter. And there's not a player in this, unless Payne or Alfonso Plummer can be impact transfers, there's not a player in this class ranked better than 91st in the 24/7 Sports Composite. And listen, there's nothing wrong with signing guys that are in the 50 to 115 range nationally. Those are really good players. You need those players, though. You need those players to be guys that come in and are 4-year guys, 4-year guys. They're developmental guys. They're guys that, stay and help you get old and stay old. And as they get older, you need them to turn into real playmakers and big time pieces for you. But I don't know that you look at Luke Good, Ramses Melendez, forgive me, I've never known how to pronounce his name, but Brandon Podziemski. I don't think you look at any of those three guys and think, well, he's likely at this point to be an immediate impact kind of high usage player. It just does feel like Illinois lost a lot that it didn't replace this offseason. And it was a really good team last year. It was as good as any team in the Big Ten. I think we all know that. But, you lost your MVP. You lost the guy who was probably most, best suited to replace him. You lost your most transformational player, and you lost a couple key pieces off your staff. In addition to a couple other hits here and there, it's not really ideal for Brad Underwood.
Another team that is getting a little bit, I guess, preseason buzz is what I could call it at this point. Andy Katz has him as his favorite to win the Big Ten, and if they are the favorite to win the Big Ten next season, I think it speaks to the league taking a step back. Pretty at the top. He's got Maryland as his pick to win the league next season, which that's contingent on Eric Ayala and Aaron Wiggins, who are both testing the NBA draft process. I think most people assume that they're going to come back. You've got Daryl Morcell, who's in the transfer portal as of right now, but I think there's a chance that he comes back to Maryland as well. But they're interesting in the fact that they've added a couple of transfers who look to be pretty good, at least on paper. Fats Russell from Rhode Island, which that's going to be one of the more fun names in the Big Ten next season. And I think I'm saying this right. Qudus Wahab from Georgetown, who played a big role in their advancement to the Big East tournament last season, making the NCAA tournament. And they've also got a top 100 recruit coming in. But I'm a little skeptical of that pick because, as you know, and I think you kind of share the same feeling as I do, I can never fully trust a Mark Turgeon coach team. So what are your thoughts kind of on Maryland going into next season? I mean, are you buying obviously, as I said, Katz has them right now as his favorite to win the Big Ten. Are you buying that? And do you think maybe this is the year that Maryland finally puts it all together under Mark Turgeon?
I don't know if I'm buying favorite. I mean, you do need to see how those three big decisions shake out. Ayala, Wiggins, and if the door is open and Morcell still does return. I think Wahab is a really good player from what I've seen, and I'm not going to pretend I've sat down here and watched every one of Georgetown's games last season, but from what I've seen, he's a really good player who I think, potentially has another gear to go up. I mean, he averaged 12.7 and 8.2 last year, and that's off averaging 5.5 and 4.3 the year before. So he already has taken a pretty big leap in his production and presumably is therefore his skill level. If he has another one to go, it's quietly a league that doesn't have a ton of big man talent. Purdue feels good about their front court. I'm sure Indiana feels good about its front court. Maybe Ohio State to some degree. But how many sort of centerpiece big men are out there in the Big Ten right now? Probably not a ton at the moment. Russell is a player that I think he can be good in the Big Ten. I really think he can. But if you look at him, his last couple of years at Rhode Island and certainly last season, he was just taking every shot under the sun. And I don't, it's impossible without knowing more about Rhode Island's backstory, and I just don't know enough to know whether that was basically, hey, Fats, we don't have anybody else. We need you to just be the guy that makes everything happen for us. Or that was maybe him getting a little bit too shot happy. But if you do get even 2 or 3 of Ayala, Wiggins, and Morcell back, then you don't need and really probably can't have Russell being too high volume of a player. And so basically what I'm saying is I wonder how big of an impact Fats Russell will have. Can he turn around and become more of a facilitator scorer, or does he have to continue to be a high volume shooter to really have an impact? Because I don't think that helps Maryland very much. And the other piece too is just, a little bit like Indiana. And this is one of the, I think there's reasons for Indiana to be encouraged, but a little bit like Indiana, one of the reasons I'm skeptical of Maryland is that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guys, 6 new players coming in. I mean, that is a heavy roster turnover if your expectation is to win the Big Ten. Now, if you say, because I think Maryland went 17-14 last year. There were a lot of people who wondered, is this it for Mark Turgeon? Is Maryland finally on? They decided to stick with him. If you're going to sell me on, well, Maryland will be good enough that Mark Turgeon won't get fired, I can buy that. It doesn't take a lot of mental gymnastics for me to buy that. I just don't know, especially when, you look around the league, you've got a team like Purdue that's got a lot of really good pieces coming back. I know Trevion Williams is still testing the waters. I guess I'm just sort of presuming he'll come back. You've got a team like Ohio State that, again, probably feels fairly good. E.J. Liddell and Dwayne Washington feels, fairly good about where it's at. I would even point to Michigan. I know Michigan's losing some pieces here, Livers, Smith, Brown, Wagner. We'll see what happens with Hunter Dickinson. That's the big one for me. But especially if Dickinson comes back, at some point it may also just be time to acknowledge that there's just kind of a Michigan way of playing basketball that endures beyond, guys coming and going. So my point is, I don't see enough heft in Maryland's roster additions to just declare that they are head and shoulders above everybody else. I think they can be better next year, certainly. And if they win the league, then I'll happily eat crow. But I just don't think I would not anoint them the favorite today, personally.
Who else from the other teams that look like they're potential contenders do you like? I mean, some of the teams that I've kind of looked at, obviously Michigan, you talked a little bit about them. My biggest question there is they've got all these 5-star players coming in, but it's hard to project what a freshman's going to look like in the Big Ten. You have some that come in and they're really good right away. You have others that are going to take time, obviously, to acclimate to the physicality, the speed of the game. Just because you're a 5-star doesn't necessarily mean that you're coming in and making a huge impact. And what they've lost, Isaiah Livers and Franz Wagner are going to be talked about a lot in terms of losses, but don't forget they also lost Mike Smith and Sean D. Brown, which those are two guys that are really important just in terms of the team. I mean, not great individual players, but they give you depth and experience at key positions. So I have some questions about Michigan. Michigan State is another one that I think is going to be pretty good. They have a lot of players returning, but they lose Aaron Henry. They're bringing in a transfer from Northeastern who had really good stats at that program, but you always kind of wonder about the guys transferring up. How does it translate? Those are two teams I think obviously are going to be in the mix, but I don't exactly know where to put them going in. And then the other one, obviously Purdue, I think right now, if I were forecasting the league, I would probably have them at the top just based on what they have coming back. And another team I think that's at least interesting, intriguing, assuming E.J. Liddell comes back, I think there's a lot to like about Ohio State. Are you with me on those four teams as kind of in the mix, maybe along with Maryland and Indiana? And is there anybody else that maybe stands out that I'm missing?
No, I mean, I think that's probably where I'm at too. I mean, I if you're asking me to pick my favorite in the conference next year, it's at this point, it's Purdue, particularly if Trevion Williams comes back, because I think, Indiana fans will remember Purdue's also adding Trey Kaufman and Caleb First. You've already got Zach Edey in there. That's a formidable front court. I think the world of Jaden Ivey. I think there's a world where Jaden Ivey is a Big Ten Player of the Year next year. I'm not saying he necessarily will be, but that's, if you try to sell me on that, that's a really easy sell. Because he's got a ton of tools and it looked like it was starting to slide into place for him at the end of last season. Ohio State is going to come down to me, almost entirely on whether the two guys, Liddell and Washington, come back. Because if they come back, then you've got a lot there. You got Justice Suing, Seth Towns, Kyle Young, Justin Ahrens. You got a lot to like, but those are two really big holes if either of those guys doesn't return. Michigan State, I just don't. I mean, this one, this year does kind of stretch the just trust Tom Izzo to figure it out theory to its breaking point. I think they've got a Max Christie coming in, plus a couple other top 100 guys. And, it is Tom Izzo. And if you look at like where the guys on their roster were ranked coming out of high school, or like in Joey Hauser's case, the expectations for him transferring in a year ago and a couple of years ago, that sort of thing, you'd think the talent's there. And there have been plenty of seasons where we've all said, oh, I don't know if this is the year for Izzo and Michigan State. Just don't know if they had the pieces in place. And then, 3 games left in the conference schedule, and there's Michigan State, 1 game ahead of everybody else at the top of the league. But that was a team that was very flawed last season, obviously, and is now losing, kind of a couple real key pieces. A lot of the guys that are left behind come with question marks. And so I would certainly I think you're right to put Indiana in kind of, if you're just kind of separating the Big Ten into tiers. If you're asking me who my favorite is, it's probably Purdue. Behind them, I would throw a blanket over Michigan, assuming Ohio State gets those guys back, Ohio State, and maybe Maryland. I think Maryland kind of occupies a bit of a middle ground between the second group and the third group, which for me also has Indiana, has Michigan State, could maybe have room for one more piece there if somebody comes up, if somebody surprises, if I don't know who, if Wisconsin hits on a great freshman, or Iowa's roster churn isn't quite as damaging, or if Illinois, if Andre Curbelo turns out to have another level, and we're not talking about, oh my gosh, how much does Illinois miss Ayo Dosunmu because somebody like that stepped into his place. But I think I would have the most faith in Purdue right now, followed probably by Michigan and Ohio State. And then I would probably have Maryland, Indiana, and Michigan State all kind of in that mix of, hey, I wouldn't be surprised if this team finishes in the top 4 or 5 in the league. I just have enough questions about them preseason that I'm not comfortable, predicting that, basically.
Last thing on this big picture, to me at least, it looks like the Big Ten's taking a pretty significant step back next year, just in terms of the quality of teams. And last year it didn't really feel like there was, Nebraska and Northwestern were bad at the bottom, but as we saw, Northwestern came in and beat Indiana at Indiana. Nebraska, they had their moments where they were competitive. This year looks like, that middle and bottom may be a little bit weaker. You just kind of look at Penn State with a new coaching situation. They lost so much. You have no idea what they're going to look like. Northwestern just kind of seems stuck in that bottom 3 or 4 for now, and with no upward momentum. Nebraska has turned over a big piece of its roster again. Minnesota has almost had a complete overturn of its roster. Rutgers lost Miles Johnson and Jacob Young. We don't know for sure what's going to happen with Geo Baker. I think Ron Harper Jr. is going to come back. But it just seems like, to me, Iowa's another one. They lost C.J. Frederick, Luka Garza. If Joe Wieskamp leaves, they're taking a big step back. It just seems like, to me, that the middle and the bottom has a chance to be a lot worse than what we saw last season. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's probably how I'd put it. Like, I could see a world where Nebraska, for example, takes a step forward with a couple good pieces coming back, and maybe a little bit better, just blend on that roster of pieces and personalities. But I think the bottom is probably going to get worse. Like, if you ask me right now, for example, Minnesota was a borderline quality win the last couple of years, even though they were never really that close to NCAA tournament contention. If you looked at their metrics and things, that under the right circumstances, Minnesota was a decent win. I don't know if we're going to be talking about them that way next year. Even the Iowas or the Illinois. And listen, not to be Debbie Downer, Indiana could be in this group too. We'll see. Well, we just don't know. New head coach, heavily remade roster. Indiana could be in this group too, but I think, when you start talking about, kind of the 8, 9, there's those first 3 tiers that I mentioned a minute ago in my own head. That's 6 teams. When you start talking about kind of like 7, 8, 9, 10, a big part of what's made the Big Ten really good in the last 2 or 3 years, from an analytics standpoint, from a metric standpoint, and then from an NCAA selection standpoint, is 7, 8, 9, 10, and even sometimes 11 and even 12 have been really good. Or at very least, have been good relative to, let's say, 7 through 11 in all the other Power 5 conferences.
Right, exactly.
And so, whereas, a couple of years ago, the ACC only gets 4 teams into the NCAA tournament field, I think. And, you look out in the Pac-12 and there's just a huge drop off after your top 3 or 4. And, the SEC has kind of fluctuated between being solid in the middle and really kind of struggling. The Big Ten has been really deep, like down to 9, down to 10, really deep. 2020, we thought the Big Ten was going to get 10 teams in the NCAA tournament, like reasonably and realistically, maybe even 11. I think where the Big Ten may take its biggest hit this year is that like 6 to 7 through 11 may not be as strong as they've been. In fact, I would venture to say they likely won't be. Maybe there'll be an upstart in there. Maybe Nebraska finishes at 8th or something like that. But that's not necessarily going to guarantee that Nebraska's a good win. That may just mean that some of the other teams around Nebraska struggle enough that Nebraska can grab a few more conference W's and move their way up the pecking order a little bit. It's, as we say, seemingly every year, and it feels like nobody listens. And then we get to Selection Sunday and people demand to know why their team's not in the NCAA tournament field. 7 through 11 affects 1 through 6, because 1 through 6 need quality beyond beating up on each other. And so much of what's made the Big Ten so formidable in the last couple of years, at least from a tournament selection standpoint, is that going all the way down to 10 or 11 was still a quality win. So maybe you only go 10 and 10 in the conference, but all 10 of those wins are quality wins, or 9 of those 10 wins are quality wins. That's where I think the Big Ten could take a step back this year, is maybe not being able to count on the depth of the conference in the way that it has. And that can have a cascade effect of, maybe all of a sudden, 6 is your max for NCAA tournament berths, because there just aren't enough quality wins out there to be gathered during the regular season. Look, again, you mentioned Rutgers. Yeah, they lose a couple key pieces. They wouldn't have wanted to lose. They wouldn't have wanted to lose Jacob Young. I was going to say Jacob Miller. I was confusing him with Adam Miller in my own head. They certainly wouldn't have wanted to lose Miles Johnson, but you still get Ron Harper back. You still get Caleb McConnell back. If you can get Geo Banker back, hey, there's still some nice pieces there. I mean, there's still, maybe we're underestimating a Wisconsin a little bit, or again, like a Nebraska a little bit. This is also, and I think this is true of all sports. Like, I suspect 5 years, 8 years, 10 years from now, when we're searching for context around this season, we're going to find that there really is none, because this season that's just passed will seem like such an outlier because of how strange it was. And how sort of affected it was by COVID, and how unique that made it. But I think, at least as things stand today, the Big Ten really could be in for a step back from a strength of schedule, metrics, selection committee preference perspective, because there's just too many teams here that I think have some really fundamental questions, unanswered questions, or fundamental flaws that are going to hold them back, and in what should be at this point a more regular season than what we just saw.
Absolutely, Zach. Thanks for the time today. You can follow Zach, as always, on Twitter at Zach Osterman. Read his stuff. Subscribe to the Indy Star. I know you're working on a variety of different things right now over at the Star, Zach. Enjoy reading your stuff, and it's good to always catch up with you on Podcast on the Brink. As far as our schedule here for the show, the next couple of months, I would expect it to be somewhat irregular, just kind of based on what news pops up. We'll obviously try to keep having regular episodes. It may not be every week, could be every other week or as news dictates. But if you enjoy the show, continue to subscribe via iTunes, Spotify, leave us a rating or review. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Thanks, everybody, for listening.